Hi everyone and welcome. Happy New Year 2023. I am Ruzbe Shah. Sorry for the long delay in releasing this video series. It's because of the Woman Life Freedom Revolution happening in my beloved country, Iran. Let's wish the best for everyone and especially for the brave and great people of Iran in this new year. But about this tutorial, I should say it's the 11th part of the series on how to develop a software application and the second part of developing a pagination component. In this video, I'll explain the logic and code behind the pagination component that we created in the previous video. I hope you'll find it useful. Let's get started. Well, the first thing about the pagination is that it should be considered as a feature for the grid component. We must be able to turn this feature on and off through the grid component. So let's add the following Boolean parameter to the grid. According to this definition, go to the grid.razor file and make the following change to code. The point that I'd like to draw your attention to is that when you write an expression like this in a razor file, that is an if statement containing only one line of code, it's better to put it in a code block, that is, wrap it in curly braces. Otherwise, you may experience some problems. By the way, while we are here, let's use the same size for the grid that we used in the pagination component so they match in size. It's very simple. Just add the CSS table-sm class to the table style. So, now open the category list.razor page that is defined in the northwind.web project in which we have used the grid component. Add the new paging parameter with a true value to the grid. This way we can easily turn the paging feature on and off. The second change we need to make is that we want to send an initial value as page size to the grid. The grid itself will pass it to the pagination component. So let's add another parameter to the grid as follows. You might be wondering why I've defined this parameter as a string. Well, if you remember from the previous video, one of the options in the page size list was the value all, which can be passed as an initial value to the grid component. For this reason, this parameter is defined as a string type here. Obviously, we have to include the validation code as well as converting the string to a numeric value as long as it's valid. The next thing is to set the page size parameter in the category list page where you have used the grid component. Now let's move on to the pagination component. The factors that are related to it are the current page number and the number of items per page, which we called page size. The page size must be defined as a parameter because its initial value will be passed by the grid component. But what about the current page number? Should we treat it as a parameter or should it be an internal field in the component? To answer such a question, you need to determine whether it should be passed from the parent component to the child or not. Although at the first glance it may seem that the page number has an internal use in the pagination component, there are situations where its value should be controlled by the parent component. An example is filtering the data grid. In such a situation, we need to reset the page value to 1 at the grid level and then send it to the pagination component. Therefore, we need to define page as a parameter too. So let's define these members of the pagination class as follows. You can see that here I've defined the page size parameter as integer and not a string, because in the pagination component we want to deal with the numeric values for the page size. Alright, let's go back to the grid.razor file and see how we can set and pass the page and page size parameters to the pagination component. For the page parameter, let's set it to 1 for now. And for the page size, because we already have it, we just need to pass it through. Right? What do you think? Well, obviously it's not working, as the red wavy line implies. It's because of the difference in the data types between the two parameters. But what about this one? If the underscore page size was a field of type integer, yes, it would work. So let's define it in the grid.razor.cs class. Now you might think that it would be better to use this field as the backing field for the page size property and use a custom getter and setter which includes the validation and conversion code. Although this seems pretty ideal, for a very subtle point, I don't bind it to the page size property. This is because if it's bound to the page size property, every time the component is rendered, its value will be overwritten or reset to the initial value specified in the category list page, that is 5 in our example, and we will lose its current value. For this reason, I want to keep it unbound and separate from the page size parameter, but at a certain time, when the component is initialized, we need to set the page size field to the value of the page size parameter. So let's write an overridden version of the OnInitialized event method with the following code, including validation and conversion. Note that in case of all for the page size value, we set it to the maximum value that an integer can have, so we assume that the page size will not exceed that value. What other information does the pagination component need to know? You remember from the previous video that the number of pages should be displayed in the page input group, as well as the number of items on the right side of the screen. It's enough to pass the number of items to the pagination component, Because having the number of items and the page size value, the number of pages can be easily calculated, and we'll see it shortly. So let's add a parameter for the number of items to the pagination component. Now we have to pass its value from the grid component as follows. It's time to calculate the number of pages, so let's declare a new field named _page_count in the code behind the pagination component. The right time to calculate the value of page count is when we have received the values of the item count and page size parameters. There's an event method called OnParametersSet that corresponds to this situation. So let's add it to the class and then write code to calculate it. Alright, we've finished providing all the required information to the pagination component. Now it's time to implement its functions. Let's start with replacing the placeholders that we added to the markup in the previous video. Go to the pagination.razor file. The first thing we can easily replace is pages in the square brackets. At this moment, we have its value in the page count field, so change it this way. Next, scroll down to almost the end of the file. We are going to replace these placeholders with their actual values. We have the number of items, so then focus on start and end placeholders. We have to calculate them here. Since we are in the middle of the HTML markup, let's first open a block of code so that we can use C# code to do the calculations. To calculate the start and end values on the current page, suppose we are currently on page number n. Given that the number of items per page is equal to page size, this means we've already gone past n-1 times page size items. So note that we've already had a property called page that represents the current page number, so replace n with that. The end item on the same page is simply calculated by the following formula. But there is a situation for which this formula doesn't work, and that is when the number of items on the last page is less than the page size value. In order for the formula to cover such a situation, it should be modified as follows. Having the start and end items calculated for the current page, we can replace the placeholders with their actual values. Okay, now let's move on to the input text controls. We need to bind them to the corresponding members of the Pagination class. First, we focus on the page text box. It should get its value from the page property. This should be a two-way data binding, meaning that the text box gets its value from the page property, and when it changes, the new value should be assigned back to the property. There are two ways to do this in Blazor. The first one is using the bind attribute. The second way is using the value attribute and the onChange event together. The value attribute does one-way data binding, that is, updating HTML DOM with the value of the page property, while the onChange event handler does the other way, that is, updating the page property from the HTML DOM. Because we want to validate the value entered the input control, I'll pick the second approach. We also need to write an event handler method for it, so go to the Pagination class and add the following method. The E parameter is the event argument for the onChange event handler that is passed to the method and contains the new value entered the input text control. Now let's implement the method. This pseudocode is just to clarify what we need to do. So let's translate the if code block to C# code. Note that if the value entered the page input control is not valid, we must restore it to the previous value. In the next video, I'll show you how to restore an input control to its previous value using JavaScript interoperability in Blazor applications. Now we need to inform the parent component, that is the grid component, that a change has occurred in the child component, that is the Pagination component. To expose events across components, use an event callback. A parent component can assign a callback method to a child component's event callback. This allows us to call the parent component's method when a child component's event occurs. Let's see how to do this. First, declare the event callback method in the pagination.razor.cs file as follows. Note that the event callback is typed with int because we are returning the new page value, which is of type integer, to the grid component. Second, go to the grid component class and create a method named onPageChange with the following signature. This is actually a delegate or callback method that we want to get called when the page changes in the Pagination component. As you can see, the new page value is sent as a parameter to this method when called. Third, we need to connect this method to the event callback we created in the pagination component. So go to the grid.razor file and add the following attribute to the pagination tag. Finally, we must invoke the callback method at the appropriate time and location in code. To do this, go back to the pagination.razor.cs file and write the following code in the onPageChange method. So, when a change to the current page is made, we invoke the callback method in the grid to notify it, plus we pass the new value of the page as a parameter to be consumed there. Now let's go back to the callback method, that is the onPageChange method that we defined in the grid.razor.cs file, and see how to complete it. As you can see, this method provides the new value of the page via its parameter to the grid component. Well, first we need to save this value for later use, and second, do the necessary action to load data into that page. So let's put some comments there to remind us of what to do later. To store the new value for the page, we could declare a new field or property in the grid class, but I'd rather create a new data structure instead, because we'll see that there's other information to store, and I don't want to declare a separate variable for each piece of them in the grid class. So let's create a new class called gridInfo that will hold all this information. Add the following properties to it. So, with such a data structure, there's no need for page size field, and we can replace it with an instance of gridInfo instead. Now we should do two things. First, initialize the page property of the gridInfo object with a value of 1 in the OnInitialized method. Second, replace page size with gridInfo.pageSize wherever used. And replace the integer literal 1 with gridInfo.page in the pagination tag as follows. Alright, go back to the onPageChange method again and set the page property of the gridInfo object to the new value. This way, we always have the updated value of page in the gridInfo object. We need to do the similar things for the page size too. Let's begin with adding the value attribute and the onChange event to the page size input control. But I see a problem here. The input control needs to show both the number and the string values. So make a slight change to the value attribute to fix the problem. Next, add the event handler for it as follows. To implement it, we can borrow the code from the OnInitialized method of the grid component and make the necessary changes to match this method as follows. So from the code, you see if the value in the page size control is all or a positive integer, we set the page size property to the appropriate value accordingly. Otherwise, we set a flag to false to indicate that the value is not valid, and in this case, we must restore the input control to its previous value. As I said before, in the next video, I'll show you how to restore the control to its previous value using JavaScript interoperability in Blazor applications. Note that if the value is valid, we must reset the current page to 1 and notify the parent component of a change to the page size. To notify the grid component of a change to the page size, we can write the similar code we wrote for page, but instead of repeating code, I prefer to use the same code with a slight change to cover the page size as well. Let's see how to do that. First, we must change the callback in a way to cover both the page and page size. Take another look at the EventCallback delegate in the Pagination.razor.cs file. You see that it's a single type parameter. One way of changing it to support passing multiple values is to use tuple type in C#. This feature provides concise syntax to group multiple data elements in a lightweight data structure without having to create an explicit one. Another way could be creating a data structure containing all the information as the type parameter. In our example, we already have such a data structure, that is the grid info object. Because of a crazy and annoying message that I observed in the markup when using tuples, I've decided to choose the second approach. So let's replace int with grid info for the type parameter. Second, scroll up until you get the onPageChange async method. We must replace the page parameter with an instance of the grid info class including both the page and page size values. Write the same statement for the onPageSizeChange method at this location. Third, go to the grid.razor.cs class and make the following changes. Rename the onPageChange method to something more comprehensive, such as onPagination change. Our purpose in choosing such a name is to reflect any changes in the pagination, whether it's page or page size. Also add page size as the second parameter to the method. Update code in the body to use the new parameter accordingly. Finally, in the grid.razor file, where you've used the pagination tag, correct the value of the callback parameter as follows. Now let's move on to the navigation buttons. We need to take the right action when users click on the buttons. Let's begin with one of them, for example, the first page button, and add the onClick event. We must add the C# event handler to the code behind and implement it, but wait a minute before that. With this approach, we have to create a separate event handler for each button, such as on first page click, on last page click, and so on, but I don't like it. I'd rather create one handler for all of them to avoid repeating code. We can achieve this by passing a parameter for each button to the handler method. So, after renaming the C# delegate event handler, we'll have something like the following. But this is not going to work. It's because the onClick event has a default parameter of type mouse event args and now takes a value of one of that type, which is not valid. In such situations, when you need to pass extra parameters in addition to the default one, you should use a lambda expression like the following. In this expression, E represents the default parameter. Let's copy and paste it for the other buttons and make the necessary changes to each one. Now we are ready to add the C# event handler to the code behind and implement it. As you see, the logic is straightforward. If the value of the new page is valid, we assign it to the page property and notify the parent of a change in the pagination component. If you run the app at this moment and click on one of the navigation buttons, you'll notice that it jumps to the home page. It's because of the default behavior of the anchor element and the value of its href attribute. To fix such a problem, add the following directive attribute to the anchor elements to prevent the default action for the click event. It's time to write code for the page size list. Like what we did for the navigation buttons, let's begin with adding the onClick event and onClick prevent default directive to all of the anchor elements in this section. So, next, add the C# event handler to the code behind with the following code. The last thing about the page size list is to highlight the selected option. We need to determine which item in the list is selected by comparing its value with the value of the page size, and if selected, add the CSS active class to its style. There are several ways to do this. One of them can be the following way. Now it's time for the refresh button. Let's begin with adding the onClick event and the onClick prevent default directive similar to the other buttons. Then add the C# event handler and code for it in the code behind. Let's move this piece of code to the top near other parameters. There's one thing left that I want to point to in this video before saying goodbye. It's about enabling and disabling buttons according to the current page value. The best time for it is when the component is rendered. Blazor provides an event handler for that called OnAfterRender. There are both sync and async versions of it. Let's override the async version in the pagination code behind. Replace code in the body with the following statement and generate the method using the quick action menu. You can choose any name that best suits the method name. Put the following code in the body. To have our code better organized, let's move this method to the bottom of the class. Note that the loss statement is just for compiling code at this time and it is temporary. In the next video, I'll show you how to enable and disable the UI elements using JavaScript interoperability. To make sure that there's no compile error in code, let's save the code files and build the solution. That's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions regarding the content of the videos, I'd be happy to discuss them with you in the comment sections. If you like this video, please do not forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the following video.